Hello and welcome to the fourth installment of big questions that we're asking during lockdown. My name is Kieran and uh, welcome if you're joining in live or whether you're watching this after the recording. Today is a topic where we're looking at, doesn't all the mess show that there's no God? Last week we looked at, is the Bible trustworthy? How can we trust it? Today I'm just going to interview again Duncan, and we're going to do a bit of a Q&A later on. Just to bring to your attention, for security reasons and data protection, we are recording this, so if you're tuning in live and you'd like to ask a question, just pop it in the chat box or email us in at myquestion@trinitychurchfinland.org. Again, if you'd like to find out more information about what Christians believe, you can visit the Christianity Explored website or visit our website at trinitychurchfinland.org. Well, without further ado, let's get into it. So, first question then, Duncan. Just, some people might bury their head in the sand when it comes to the question of the mess in the world. So, just asking you, would you acknowledge that there is mess in the world and it's pretty messed up in some ways?
Hi, good morning, Kieran. Yeah, I definitely, the world is messy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, if you look on you have to look out there. I mean, we're in the middle of a mess, aren't we, with COVID-19, and then there was Brexit. Remember that? Before that, and it wasn't that long ago that we were in very, very high alert about terrorism, financial crashes, and that leaves aside the kind of global warming stuff and climate change. That's just out there. It's messy, and if you kind of put your own life under the microscope, that's pretty messy too, isn't it? That we there are problems in our own lives, our own characters, our own circumstances, and I'm just aware that people, particularly now, will be finding that very difficult on a personal level of maybe grief, or maybe not being able to see loved ones that we haven't seen for months. I mean, I know I haven't seen my parents since Christmas, and that's an awfully long time. So yeah, there's mess everywhere. I don't think we want to deny that in any way. I don't think a Christian would ever deny that. In fact, we have to kind of acknowledge that before we get anywhere. And that's the reality we face. So I really do understand the question. What's behind it is a sense of, well, shouldn't somebody sort this out? And if there is a God, why isn't he? So yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, it's messy.
Yeah. So can you explain the mess to us then?
Well, on one level, no, because as we've said a number of times on this kind of format, that we can't see everything. We're limited in our understanding and our scope. So no, I wouldn't even attempt to try. And I think actually sometimes when Christians do that and people are feeling the mess very intensely, that really rides roughshod over people's emotional experience. And sometimes Christians are far too quick to speak and say things like, well, this will turn out for good and so on like that. And that can come across as very crass and uncaring because we don't know. And so often we don't know. So on one level, no, I can't answer the question. But on another level, yes, I can give some response from a biblical perspective about what is going on. That just because that there is mess that we experience now doesn't mean logically that there's no God. There may be an answer to it that we just can't see. But yeah, that's a brief answer. You can push me further.
Okay. Yes, it's helpful to understand that we can't understand it all, and we're very limited. I think people's pushback would be on that is they need a little bit more. Perhaps in a minute we can think about how the messiness in the world kind of shows that we have a desire or see the need for order. So before that, maybe you could just say a little bit more.
Yeah, Yeah, sure. I wasn't saying that was the end of it. I just was giving a pause for thought.
Right.
I think that, so actually on the Christianity Explored website, there's a helpful video by one of the lecturers at Oak Hill College in London, a theological college, and she very helpfully in the video talks about Harry Potter and her love for books and her own personal love for books, and just saying, if you know, imagine we all know there's 7 books to Harry Potter. I know they all merge into one, but there are 7 individual books. And imagine if somebody just walks in on book 3, with Prisoner of Azkaban, I think it is, and picks that book off the shelf and reads just one page where I think it's the Whomping Willow sort of smashes up Harry and the others, and reads that page and goes, what a messy, violent, horrible story. What a load of rubbish. I wouldn't want to read that. And I suppose our response to that would be, well, yeah, I mean, that there is messiness and violence and nastiness on that page, but hold on a minute. There's a whole book, and not just one book. There's a whole series of books which encompass a massive story that goes over seven great pieces. And just because you're caught up in that page doesn't mean that you dismiss that there's a bigger story. And of course, in that story, triumph overcomes evil and is victorious over evil. So, and I think what we tend to do is that we tend to approach life like that. We experience mess in our own lives now. We experience mess in the world now, but that's just a snippet. That's just like picking one page or one scene of Harry Potter and then assuming that that is the whole picture. But of course, the question's got to come is actually, is that really everything that we experience in that one moment? And it would be odd to assume that that is the case. We want to read to the end of the story. It's keen to find out whether the evil is overcome. And of course, the Christian answer is that that is the case, that Christ has triumphed over evil and death and has risen and is going to come back and deal with it. So we want to hold the whole picture together and not just take a snippet out of context.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and perhaps we'll think about that in more detail later on. But just that question, because there's mess in the world, people recognize the need for order and they have the kind of desire for order. Would you agree with that? And what would you add to that? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's a helpful way of looking at it. We can look at the world. We can look at the world from 2 directions. We can say that there's mess, so there's no God, or we can look at it the other way around and say, well, hold on a minute. The fact that we are uncomfortable with the mess, the fact that we desire order, suggests that order ought to be the norm. I mean, I think that's what we feel instinctively when there's the stuff that goes wrong. We go, it shouldn't be this way. And therefore, that seems to suggest that actually, look at it the other way around, that the norm is supposed to be orderly, and that for some reason that's gone wrong, and there is a mess that's invaded the normalcy. And that fits exactly with the Bible's picture that we've got a God of order. That's why we have seasons. That's why there's summer and winter and springtime and all that kind of stuff, is that there is an order in our world, and we long for that, and we know that that's right, and that something's gone wrong. Now, of course, the biblical answer to that is that the world has gone through what we call the fall, that humanity has turned against God, and for that reason, the world doesn't work as it should. We're not supposed to die. That comes as a shock to many people, but we're not supposed to die, and that's why death feels very, very wrong. And of course, Jesus defeats that, which is the wonderful truth of Christianity.
Yeah, in many ways, the kind of the topic of today is a very personal and feeling-based topic. So, kind of leading into that, what does the Bible say about the mess? You've touched on it a little bit in that the world is not as how it's supposed to be, and that's why Jesus came. But could you just elaborate on that and help us to think that through a little bit more?
Yeah. So the world is in a mess because of human rebellion. So in the story of Adam and Eve, and I'm not going to get into the literal kind of, is there a real Adam and Eve and the snake and all that kind of stuff. There's a kind of mixture of symbolism in that as well as reality in that. So we've got to get into the head of the person that wrote that, who I think was Moses. But the point being that humanity has turned its back on God, and God says, you eat of the fruit, you will die, you will surely die, and so that is the problem. But within that, there is a story that already developed. So in God's punishment of the snake, the Lord promises that one day someone will come from Eve's line who will crush the snake, and therefore symbolically deal with evil and wrong in our world. And that's exactly what happens in Jesus Christ. He's the long-awaited one who comes and crushes what we would call sin, which is human rebellion against God, and thievery at God's authority in the world, trying to work things out for ourselves, and that he dies for that in our place for our sin and rises again to defeat it. So there's a victory over it, but of course it takes thousands of years for that victory to emerge, and then lots of people on the way don't know how they fit into the story, and that's where I think it really comes into us. Sometimes we just can't see where we fit into the big story, and that's the frustration for us. Yet, and it must have felt like that for Jesus in a way, because it looked like a failure. It looked like a disaster, didn't it, as he's hanging on the cross? But yet, God was using what looked disastrous and a failure. Certainly for those looking on, it looked a failure. For Jesus' disciples who all ran away. But yet, that was the means of God's rescue. So we're not to judge things by how they appear in that sense, but they can lead to something greater. Now, I often think of this. I mean, this is a rather simple example, but we've got four children, and and I say to the boys sometimes, when they don't get what they want, say, well, do you think that Dad loves you? Yes, they grudgingly say. But the point being is, well, then I'll do what is best for you. I won't necessarily do what you want. And of course, when they're very little children and they're ill, and they're crying out in the night, and you give them Calpol, and you've got the syringe, full of Calpol, and you are literally having to kind of grip this child who's writhing in your arms to put in the syringe. It doesn't feel like that you're helping them or loving them, but yeah, actually you're doing what's best for them. And I think there's a sense that we just can't see sometimes. It's very black, it's very dark, it's very confusing, it's very messy, but that doesn't mean that it's completely out of control. Now, I realize all that can sound pretty harsh for somebody who's experiencing that pain and difficulty now, and who's very much into the mess. Please don't hear that as not being sensitive to that, but it's just saying that there can be something bigger that's beyond us that we just cannot see, and we know that from the experience of our own lives.
Yeah, and a lot of people who I've encountered have said things like, well, not intentionally or not specifically said they don't need Jesus to come back, or they don't need God to deal with the problems. If only humans try harder, if only humans did better, if only we put enough emphasis on preserving the planet, all this would be dealt with eventually with enough human effort. What do you think you'd see about that, if you would, and what does the Bible say about that kind of claim?
Well, the answer, I suppose, is that the Bible doesn't give us specifics on that, but it fits into that wider story that we've been talking about. So on the one level, yeah, we should care for our planet, the stuff that we should do. So, we're not to go, oh, well, this isn't going to work. There's no point in recycling, for example. That would be crass, and God has created something. I was talking to my kids this morning about a strawberry over breakfast, and just thinking about how amazing it is, little yellow pips around a strawberry, and how that decays and then becomes a whole strawberry plant from one of those little tiny seeds. That's just amazing when you stop to think about it. Of course, we don't think about it very often, but those sort of miraculous things are around us all the time, but we just don't call them that. So I've lost my train of thought completely. Why did I mention strawberries?
I have no idea. Just thinking just thinking a little bit about how often people say, with enough human effort, we'll get there. We
Yeah.
just need to keep going.
Yeah, so we should. My point was we should care about the world because God has created things like strawberries. He cares that much. That was my point. There's the That's
Right.
the strawberry stuff. So yeah, we should care about the world. We should do those kind of things. We should make effort. But I suppose the point is, and human experience bears this out, is that it's never going to work perfectly. Hello, it's one of my sons. This is never going to work perfectly. We're never going to be able to solve these things ourselves. We can't. And again, I think COVID really helps us see that. You've got some of the brightest, most brilliant minds in the world, and yet our world has been stopped basically in the space of a few months. And even going, oh, we can sort this out in 12 weeks. Well, we can't really, and we have to wait for a vaccine that might not be possible to solve it. It's quite proud of humanity to think, hey, we can sort the world out and make it okay, because it just doesn't work. And you and I know that in our own characters, Kieran, as well, don't we? We might go, oh, it's New Year, I'm going to turn over a new leaf, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to be super fit this year, or I'm going to get less angry, or I'm going to be more sensitive. But the reality is that doesn't last much beyond the third week of January, if the second day of January.
Yeah, it's helpful just to think about. So now a bit of a Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, pop it in the chat box, or again, email us in and we'll get around to answering that at some point. We've got a few questions here just to help us think a little bit further. So it says, in the past, in the Bible, God has acted in kind of miraculous ways to save people from, the messiness of life. And it's not always in our experience today where we see that kind of thing. Can you give any reason why we don't see things like that happening anymore?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question about miracles. I can give a very brief answer to that. First of all, I think I'd say, what's a miracle? We talked about strawberries earlier. When you stop and think about how a strawberry reproduces, I think that's pretty extraordinarily miraculous. So I just want to challenge and push back on what is a miracle. It's a miracle that you and I can take the next breath, I think. And the way we've defined stuff. I suppose what people mean by that is it's something that steps out the normal bounds of how the world works, and the order that we normally see, which, by the way, points that there is an order in our world again. I think it's fair to say that the Bible actually has, if you think about the span of history that it covers, relatively few episodes of miracles. They cluster together, actually. And so we'd be better to think that, of course, God can do that, and we wouldn't want to deny that, but he doesn't necessarily do that all the time. In fact, quite often he works through the normal processes of human history and behavior. So yes, those miracles can happen now, and who knows whether they are in other parts of the world, but that doesn't mean that we should expect them to happen now. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I think it's just getting the as you mentioned before, the kind of big picture of things. Next question, then. Why does it appear that God is taking so long to deal with the mess? You said that Jesus came, of course, to deal with the mess, and the problem was that rebellion against God. And in the Bible, it says that Jesus will come again and deal with that. Why does it appear so long? And why does it feel like it takes God so long to deal with the mess?
Oh,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's a helpful question, and again, we referred to this a few times in these conversations we've had. But God is not like us, and so that's just a really simple but very, very important thing to grasp. That God is not like us. He's not just a much bigger, puffed up version of us, like we've got a bicycle pump and just puffed up bigger version. So God's relationship to time. He created time. So the Bible talks about him with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years like the day. So time is a different concept to God as it is to us. Now that's hard for us to understand, but if God is that easy to understand, he wouldn't be God, right? So yeah, that's one aspect of it. But also that the Bible gives us an insight into the fact that God is using this time. He's in fact holding back. Imagine a kind of dam holding back water. He's holding back his judgment of what is wrong in the world, to give people more time to turn to him. So thinking of Jesus, when one time a tower collapsed and his friends and people saw it and said, well, those people are inside that tower, they must have been really bad sinners. And Jesus says, no, there's not necessarily the connection with them and their sin, although of course every human being is a sinner to some degree or another. What he's saying is that use that as a warning that something worse doesn't happen to you. And of course, he doesn't mean that you are necessarily worse than the people in the tower. What he means is that there is a worse judgment coming when there's a reckoning for the whole world. And all of us will be caught up in that, because by nature, as we've all turned away, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So therefore, this is a graciousness of God that he's not yet brought that day of judgment. He's holding it back to give people time to turn to him and ask for forgiveness and find life in his son. So the time is not to be seen, the delay is not to be seen as him being annoying. The delay is him being kind. So if you're listening into this, can I urge you to, there's a real urgency here. Time is running out. And every day is a day nearer to Christ's return, and we all will have to go, what are we going to do about it? And if COVID has taught us anything, it's another sign to say, a bit like that tower, where do you stand? What are you going to do about it? And it's also woken us up to reality that we're not in control, and there is powers beyond us. So it's a wake up and smell the coffee type moment for all of us, I think.
Mm. And as you rightly pointed out earlier, for some people, I was just thinking the topic might stir up anger. So, maybe someone has lost a loved one for whatever reason. Maybe it's something as shocking as an earthquake or a car crash, or even cancer, as devastating as it is. Just could you speak a little bit about how the Bible would comfort people who go through the kind of mess in life? And in some ways, all of us go through that, and all of us will eventually die. But for the person who is struggling with that now, the person who is right bang in the mess now, how does the Bible speak to them?
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. I mean, and it's so helpful to think in that way, because sometimes it's very easy to give an answer, and those are not necessarily answers you need in the middle of grief or pain. I would want to say, I think that it's right, that sense of anger is not wrong. In fact, it's a sign that you recognize that the world isn't as it's supposed to be. And so it's absolutely right if somebody's died tragically. If I lost one of my children, I should be angry that life has been snuffed out, and that's a perfectly normal human response at what is evil in our world. So I'd want to acknowledge that, and say that the Bible is really honest about that we lament, we grieve, and sometimes there are no answers. I mean, there's a whole Bible book on the man called Job who experiences terrible suffering, and the answers are not obvious to him, and so often he just sits in silence, and I think we should recognize that. I'd also want to say that two other things. One is, first of all, that God understands that, because in Christ he's experienced that himself, in that he stood at the graveside of a dear friend who's died, and he knew that he was going to raise him just a few minutes later, yet he wept. People probably know that's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. So even though when Jesus knows he's going to solve the problem, he still understands. And we will take huge comfort from that God knows. And then, of course, there's the final thing, which is that bigger story stuff. We began earlier thinking about Harry Potter, and you wouldn't take things out of context. We can't see. But we are given enough to know that the end is going to be one of victory. And we have the assurance of that because Christ has triumphed over evil and death in his resurrection. So there is great hope, even though we can't see it. And there's a lot of groaning and pain in the waiting, but we know that waiting will be over because it's evidenced in the person of Jesus Christ. And Kieran, if I may, I've often used the image of a tapestry in this. That you understand a tapestry in a castle or something like that, big whopping great thing. If you go to the rear side of a tapestry, it's just a mess, right? Of jumbled up pieces of yarn and knots, and you can't make sense of what on earth the picture is on the other side. But then when you go to the other side, you see that every knot and piece was perfectly positioned, every thread, to produce a wonderful picture. And there's a sense where that is our experience as human beings, that we live on the rear side of the tapestry. Everything's a mess. It's knotted. It doesn't make sense. But then in the new creation that is going to be ushered in by Christ, we'll see the other side and see how everything was perfectly placed to produce a beautiful picture in the future. We won't understand that fully, or maybe even in part now, but we have that promise, and that's seen again and again through the whole story of the Bible.
Well, thank you, Duggan, for taking the time to speak with us today and to help us think about that topic. I know it's a real personal one, and it can really hit home when we think about it in any depth. I think that's all we've got time for today. But just to see, if you're tuning in live and you'd like again to reach out to us to ask any questions, to chat further with us, please do that with the means that we have available for you. And if you'd like to speak about this topic in more detail with a Christian, or you'd like to chat about your experiences, your hardships and struggles and the messiness of life, please do that. Contact us, email us. We'd love to speak to you. Again, thanks, Duncan, for taking the time. See you again next time.
Pleasure. Bye.